In this video, I'm going to walk you through 4 plus 1 bonus ways to monetize your podcast. So if you are a podcaster or somebody who's looking to start a podcast but doesn't know how to actually monetize it, this video is for you. So I'm going to talk about ads, I'm going to talk about subscription-based model, I'm going to talk about sponsorship models, also and including affiliate marketing. I'm going to talk about having your own offer and your own business behind the podcast, whether you already have a business or not. And the fifth way is a bit of a bonus, is going to be about planning events around the podcast or with the community and the audience that you've built with the podcast. So in order to walk you through this, I need to talk about something first that is absolutely critical when it comes to podcast monetization. And it is the audience goodwill. What do I mean with that? So it's all down to the give to ask ratio, right? Whatever you choose to do when it comes to monetization of your podcast, you cannot have too many asks, right? You need to be focusing on the value first, on providing value to the audience. This is super important. And if we look at the give to ask ratio of the most mainstream media, right, which is a good thing to look at because you have millions of people, professionals who have studied how to best optimize give to ask ratio with ads, for instance. So when you look at TV, for instance, mainstream TV, right? And if we take a primetime show at, 8 p.m., you're going to see that most of the time you're going to get about 43 to 47 minutes of content for approximately 13 to 17 minutes of ads. And this is because you're going to get a 3-to-1 ratio, right? You're going to receive 3 times and get asked 1 time, kind of. If you look at Facebook and Instagram, which is another behemoth of the advertising industry, you also see there that most of the time you will scroll, right, and see 3 pieces of content, whether that's new content or from somebody that you follow. But then the 4th post will be an ad. So here again, we find this 3-to-1 ratio. And this is a good ratio to bear in mind when it comes to advertising, audience goodwill, and sponsorship in general. It's like we must make sure not to go over this 3-to-1 ratio, because if for half the duration of your podcast you ask people and then half the duration you actually give, this is a bit off balance, right? And actually in most of the podcasts that we manage and that we've run for ourselves and for our clients, the ratio is even lower. We make sure to have like an almost 9-to-1 ratio because it's super important to give first and foremost. The other thing I want to talk about is niche. So the more niche your audience will be, obviously the smaller it will be in most of the cases, but the better it can be. Meaning whether we're going to talk about ads, about subscription-based model, about sponsorship, about offer, if your audience is super niche, but then you have a typical avatar in your audience, then it's super easy to monetize because you're like, hey, I know that this audience typically likes this, and this. They have this, and this problem, and this is how I can help them solve it by having a tailored offer for that niche audience. So audience goodwill and niching down are 2 principles that are super important to bear in mind when we are looking at podcast monetization. So whether you're going to start a podcast or whether you already have a podcast but want to potentially narrow down the audience, this can be super interesting to do because riches are in the niches, as we say. And if you look at a niche that has high purchasing power and problems to solve, this is where you make the most money. This is the small parenthesis before we get on with the 5 ways to monetize your podcast. Well, 4 plus 1, should I say? But I think it's super important to bear those concepts in mind. Now, let's talk about ads. So ads is kind of the easiest way to monetize a podcast, right? And it's something that you can set up now on most of the hosting platforms, right? So you're going to have this on Buzzsprout, on Red Circle, on Spreaker, on Megaphone, on Castos, and so on and so forth. So those are all podcast hosting platforms, and you can very easily set up ads on that, whether that's static or dynamic. Not going to enter into too much details, but basically static is like, hey, I want to have an ad at this point in time, and it will be this ad for the rest of the podcast life, versus dynamic, which is, hey, I'm going to have an ad here, another ad here. But then if in the future you decide to change the announcer, to change the actual ads, it stays at the same spot, but the ad in itself changes. So it allows you to adapt a bit and make sure that you get more downloads for the new sponsors that you get. So the whole thing with ads is that, first of all, it's probably the lowest return on investment that you can get for the number of downloads. It's not necessarily the lowest just return on investment for your podcast, but at least for the number of downloads. To get to the crux of it, when it comes to advertisement on your podcast, and here we are talking about static and dynamic ads insertion, something that you can do on any platforms. So the way it's going to work is you go to one of those platforms and you're going to have propositions from those platforms saying, hey, we have these couple dozens of announcers. They want to put ads on as many shows as possible. And we're going to get back to this in a moment. And they propose that much amount of money for it. Usually what happens is that it's very not much targeted to your audience. Back to the importance of niching down, right? So you can expect somewhere between 10, 20, maybe $25 per 1,000 downloads, right? So this takes a very large audience to actually make very good money out of, which is why it's much more suited to big podcasts who are a bit more mass market, right? Who do not have really a niched down audience, but who will be like, hey, I have hundreds of thousands of downloads every month, if not millions of downloads every month on my podcast. Then it makes a lot of sense to have an ad that will bring back like $10 to $25 per 1,000 downloads. If you are a smaller podcast, which is the case of 99% of the podcasters, so likely you as well, ads might be interesting to start monetizing a bit, right? So to pay off the podcast hosting subscription, eventually a bit of gear, but that's not going to be life changing, right? It's very easy to set up, but the offset is that it is not making you lots of money. Now, back to the audience goodwill and the niching down as well. And this is something that we're going to get back to on all the ways to monetize a podcast. When it comes to ads, you're basically going to be advertising something that the platforms proposes you, right? So it's not going to be targeted to your audience. Actually, on the contrary, right? It's going to be something that an announcer wants to be published on as many podcasts as possible because they know if they reach the masses, eventually some people will opt in, some people will purchase, which is also why the price is that low. It's because it takes a lot of exposure for those advertisers to actually make a return on investment and to actually get purchases. So not only is it not bringing lots of money, it's also not very much targeted to your audience, which might consume a bit of your audience goodwill, because let's say you have a podcast about how to raise your dog and how to properly, take care of your dog. If all of a sudden you start having car advertisements on your podcast or even insurance advertisement on your podcast, then the audience is like, yeah, for sure, maybe some of them, like a very small fraction of them, will be interested in cars or purchasing a new insurance, but it's not what they are on the show for, right? They are on the show to learn about their dogs. They are on the show to learn about how to better raise their dog. And if you put an insurance ad, well, it might not hurt. Nobody likes ads, so it might hurt a bit, but not that much. But it's also not helping them, right? So it's very not targeted. I'm mentioning this because that's going to be a concept that's going to come back in this video later on. So ads on the podcast, whether that's static or dynamic, $10 to $25 per 1,000 downloads, not really niche down, not really targeted to your audience, but very easy to set up. And that's the first way you can monetize your podcast. To my clients, I really recommend this only if you have a very big audience, at least a couple hundreds of thousands of downloads a month, because otherwise you're not really building a business out of your podcast. You may be doing a bit of side money, but that is it. Second way to monetize your podcast is the subscription-based model. So what do we mean by that? A subscription-based model is basically, you're going to be telling to your audience, hey, look, I have this content for free on my podcast. You can also find me on social media, YouTube, wherever you're publishing the podcast content, right? But if you want to support me, or if you want to get a few additional things, you can subscribe to my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, Buzzsprout, YouTube Premium, Twitch sub if you have a Twitch channel on top of that. The whole point is that you're going to keep on publishing the podcast for free, but you're also going to be proposing for people willing to pay $5 to $10 per month, some extra content, some more interaction with you, maybe some monthly Q&A, or like this kind of things. Now, subscription-based model. So this one is a very interesting one, because when it comes to the goodwill of the audience, it's very good, because you're basically saying, hey, all this is for free for you. You're not going to get ads from me whatsoever. But if you want a bit more interaction with me, or if you want more content from me, or if you just want to support the show, which is often a good motivation enough for an engaged audience, you can subscribe to my Patreon, you can subscribe to my Buzzsprout subscription, you can subscribe to so and so. And this is very interesting, because this allows you to not tap too much into the audience goodwill, provide additional value for people who want to support you, and depending on how you tailor this subscription-based model, there can really be a lot of value there for the listener. I'm gonna get back to this in a few seconds. Now, when it comes to the economics of this model, so at this one, you can expect $5 to $10 per person opting in, right, every month, knowing that you can have churn on it, meaning some people will leave after a while. So usually you can have most of the people leaving after 3 to 4 months, unless you have a very, very engaged audience. But it starts to become a bit more interesting than the ads, in our opinion, because this is much better in terms of audience goodwill. You create a rapport with your audience, which is super, super important. You play on the community aspect, right, which is also a very good and important thing, especially nowadays. And you provide more of what people are already coming for on the podcast. And that's where it comes to niching down, right? If you have a niche and if you're like, hey, you are somebody who has a dog who wants to take care of his dog or her dog, come on my Patreon and you'll have even more of that and more value and more interaction. And maybe I can help you one-to-one with that. So in terms of audience goodwill and niching down, this is super, super good. Now, you can expect for a good podcast, right, the podcast going on well and having an engaged audience, 0.5 to 1% of the audience to opt in your subscription-based model, especially on the $5 to $10 range. This is not a big commitment. If it's somebody listening to you very often, it's like a way to show their support. So you can expect this kind of numbers. Now, again, if we look at actual numbers, right, most of the podcasts, they are getting a few thousand downloads per month, if not less. So that means in terms of unique people, it's a bit less again. So let's say you manage to get, 20 people on the Patreon, right, for $10 a month. This is $200 a month. For this size of audience, this will pay much more than the ads, for sure. It's better in terms of audience goodwill and niche, but it's still not life-changing, right? It can be very good once you start reaching a few dozens of thousands of views every month, if not hundreds of thousands of views / downloads every month, because there you can really have a compounding effect, a snowball effect on this subscription-based model, provide more and more value and make more and more money. And these kinds of become a bit more life-changing when you start making a few thousands, if not more, dollars thanks and out of this subscription-based model. Now, there is a caveat to all this. You need to be very mindful about what you promise in the subscription-based model, because you have to bear in mind that this is even more work. If you want this to work properly, if you want people to stay tuned in, you're going to have to put out more content, right? Whether that's a monthly Ask Me Anything session or a monthly Zoom call with all the subscribers or something a bit more premium for the people wanting to pay $20, $30, $50 a month, right? One-to-ones. This is actually additional work. So this is not to be overlooked. Whilst it's very interesting to build a community, to build like something around your podcast that brings money, you have to bear in mind that it can be a bit of additional work. We've seen some clients coming to us and being like, yeah, on my free podcast, I have ads, and on my subscription-based podcast, people have the episodes a bit earlier and without any ads, which is kind of an interesting way to compromise. Now, there is not that much more value for us in the subscription-based model when we approach it like this. It can be a quick win if you start implementing this model, but at some point you want to offer something on top so people stay longer and are potentially paying more. This is for the subscription-based model. Let's move on to the sponsorship-based model. So for the sponsorship-based model, this is where it can become very, very interesting. So here, the way it works is you will have a sponsor or a few sponsors that you have a one-to-one relationship to, meaning it's not happening through a podcast hosting platform. It's you or them who reaches out to the other and be like, hey, I have a podcast about ABC. I would like you to sponsor my show because you seem like a good fit. Now, what does that mean exactly? So when you have a sponsor or when you approach a sponsor, you have to bear in mind, okay, I'm going to do some host-read ad on the show, right? So it's basically at the beginning, maybe the middle, and eventually the end of your episode, you're going to give a shout out to the sponsor, the said brand, and potentially praise the product of this brand. The whole thing here is you need to plan that properly, meaning the more niche down your podcast is, the more niche your audience is, the better the sponsorship contracts and deals can be. Because you're like, hey, actually my audience of a few hundreds or a few thousands people is the ideal client of that and that brand. Meaning, hey guys, if you sponsor my show, you won't have to do anything to reach actually your ideal customers. And it will be praised and talked about by somebody they trust. So if I also trust in your product, it will be like double effective. So you can really benefit from sponsoring my show. And this is how it's going to happen, right? You're going to have a call to action or a shout out at the beginning, typically in the middle and towards the end as well. Now, if we look back at our model, right? Audience goodwill and then niche. So in terms of audience goodwill, here we are a bit between the subscription-based model and the ads, in the sense that nobody likes ads, nobody likes sponsors. It's fine. Everybody would like to have everything for free, right? Obviously. Now, the thing here is, whilst it's still an ad, so it can be perceived negatively, and maybe you will have 1 or 2% of your audience complaining, which is normal. This happens all the time. It's still very much targeted to them, right? So it's like, hey, actually, you're listening to this podcast for a while now. You're taking care of your dog. You probably made progress in raising him or her or it, however we want to position it. Just so you know, I've partnered with that brand who offers premium dog food, allowing you to, take care of your dog even more. But that becomes super relevant. Like, you're not trying to sell them insurance policy or a car that doesn't fit their need. You're actually advertising something that might actually help them and they might actually need, and that they actually came on the podcast to get forms of advice for, right? Because if you have a podcast about dogs, you probably talked about dog food at some point. So this becomes much more relevant. It's much more likely to be perceived positively and to create engagement, right? Especially if you truly believe in the brand. So this is where sponsorship models become interesting. Now, another very important notion when it comes to sponsorship. When it comes to the money aspect, right, the return on investment, what can you expect from a sponsorship model? So obviously here we are looking at much more than static and dynamic advertising, because it's much more targeted, right? So it's always the same thing. If you have somebody willing to pay for your product, you might want to put a bit more money to get in front of that person, right? It's just like the ABCs of advertising. So if I am a dog food brand who is having to choose between, 10,000 podcasts all talking about different things, maybe there will be some listeners who have dogs, and maybe there will be some listeners who want to find more premium food for their dog. But if I go on a specific dog raising podcast, then the audience that will be hearing my advertisements is much more qualified. So it's like much less steps to get engaged with this audience. So this becomes much more interesting. I know I will have more people reacting to my ads, so I might be willing to pay a bit more. Where am I going with this? So the smaller sponsorship contracts that we've seen, and we really are talking about the smaller sponsorship contracts, is like about $200 to $300 per 1,000 downloads. This is the very least that we've seen. And we have clients who have like really niche down audience who are getting sponsors paying $1 up to $2 and even $3 per download, not per 1,000 downloads, per download. That means $3,000 per 1,000 downloads, basically. Now, how does that work? Back to the fact of niching down as much as possible, right? We have certain podcasts under management who have like very specific niches, very specific audience, like a few thousand people listening to them every month, right? But those are people with very high purchasing power in very high positions in certain companies. And when they're hearing about a specific product on the podcast, not only are they super engaged with the host reading them, but it's also like, wait a second, this might be super relevant for my finance department, for instance. And now we are talking about multiple dozens of thousands of dollars of deals, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of deals. And if you get 1% of the audience to purchase every year, you already make up for a lot of return on investment on the ads. So back to the importance of niching down, this is where it becomes super effective. It's when you have a very specific niche, you find very specific sponsors, you're able to charge them much more, but it's also because they are going to make a bigger return on investment. So in our opinion, sponsorship models become much more interesting, especially if you have a niched down podcast. Now, there is a type of sponsorship that I'd like to talk about in this video. It is the affiliate marketing model. This is one model that we have in place for one of our own podcasts, Corporate Treasury 101. It can be very, very effective. Very quickly, how it works is you actually do not get paid for reading the ad, right? You only get paid per people using your discount code, for instance, in order to purchase the product that you are advertising. So it's a bit more risky for the podcaster here because you're not getting paid anything unless your audience purchases. But that also means that you can get much higher return on investment if your audience actually purchase. So that will work if you have a very niche down audience. And here you can have like 15 up to 20, maybe even 30% sometimes cut on the product sold. Meaning if you are advertising a few $1,000s product, if not a few dozens of $1,000s product, and some of the people within your audience are purchasing it, you can make very, very, very good money. We are doing that with one of our podcasts and it's quite profitable because the audience is so niche down. It's actually helping them, back to the being genuine, taking care of the audience goodwill and niching down. It's really something that we believe will help them. So we are not afraid of advertising it. It's also, we are advertising it like literally for 1 minute in a 58 to 1 hour episode. So back to that ratio, right? And it can be very, very interesting. Here again, you need to be careful if you are entering into the podcasting world and you're not too aware of how to do this yet, because advertising, affiliate marketing deals means you are not getting paid at all. So you might consume a bit of your audience goodwill. So it takes really to know your audience, to know exactly what they want, what they need, and what will help them, what they would be willing to pay for, and their purchasing power as well, right? Because again, if you are having a podcast about job seekers and how to find a job, well, people in your audience might not be in the best position to actually purchase anything, right? Because they are out of a job and they are actually looking to apply for jobs and find one. So this is all coming down to who is your audience, who is your sponsor's ideal clients, and how do you match the two together. All right, on to the fourth way to monetize your podcast. We start coming into one of my favorite model because it can be the most profitable one. Now, this one takes a bit of a specific setup to put in place, right? So the fourth way to monetize your podcast is having an offer of your own. What I mean by that is if you have a company, if you have a business, if you have a coaching business, if you have a consulting business, if you have anything eventually online, but even in a physical location that you actually sell to people already, the podcast might be the best opportunity for you to bring additional traffic towards this business. Now, how does this all work? So, and by the way, if you do not have a business, this is something that you can create, right? You can create an offer around the podcast, especially if you've been doing this for multiple years and you know more than the average person in your specific niche, right? This is where the money is made. So, having your own offer, how does it all work? So first of all, you need to make sure that the podcast is somehow related to this offer, right? If you have a dog training podcast and you are selling insurance in your company, well, as we saw before, this might not be the best match, right? To make sure that your audience is purchasing your product. Now, maybe some of them will, but it will be a very small fraction. What you want to do is basically have a podcast that is somehow or very much related to your business. Typically, having a dog training podcast and a dog training business. This is the best of both worlds, right? Because you're going to be able to provide expert advice on your podcast whilst also saying, hey guys, all this is for free, like I hope you're getting as much value as possible. If you're interested into taking the next step of having somebody actually helping you train your dog, you can check out my website or you can check out my services and let's see if we can work together. So having those two related is super, super important. Now, the other thing that you need to have in place is kind of a system, right? Because somebody listening to your podcast doesn't mean they are going to directly buy your product, right? There needs to be some things happening in the meantime. The way this typically works is you're going to have a few things around the podcast. First of all, you want to repurpose the content of the podcast as much as possible. You want to make it easy for people to engage with you and build trust with you. And this happens by having multiple touch points on multiple platforms, whether that's on the podcast, on your website, but also everything in between, social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, right? People will want to build trust with you, engage with you before they will purchase anything from you. And the great news is you're already releasing amazing content. This podcast that I'm recording right now is going to be used for TikTok videos, YouTube shorts, Instagram posts, LinkedIn posts, and so on and so forth. So having this ecosystem around the podcast is super, super important. Again, having people consuming content from you, it doesn't mean that they are going to purchase from you. You need to help them take some steps. So the way this typically works is you're going to have a small step that people are going to have to take at some point if they want more. Not something paid for yet, but a small engagement. What we love to do on our own podcast and on our clients' podcast is to have a website, obviously, with an opt-in form saying, hey, if you want our free ebook on how to train your dog in 4 weeks to sit down and go and fetch the ball as soon as you ask them, just throwing a random example here, download my free ebook. I just need your email address in order to send you the ebook and then you can have it for free. Now, people have to take a small step here, but it's not paid for yet, right? It's just giving their email address for actually more value. By the way, it's super important that this free ebook or whatever you offer for free is as qualitative as possible. Like high quality content is like the foundation of taking people from free to paid for, even if it's not paid for yet. It's super, super important. And all of a sudden, you have people's email addresses. You have people who have engaged with you on social media, who have listened to you on the podcast, who have downloaded the free ebook from you. And now you have their email address. And this is where the magic happens. If you nurture them properly, if you prompt them towards, hey, you've been following all those steps, you've been implementing all this. Now, if you really want to go to the next level, what I propose is that we discuss how we can potentially help you with the training of your dog. And this is how you take people from listening to your podcast to purchasing an offer. Down to the money side of things, right? To the return on investment of that. Now, the logic here is simple, especially according to us. If you have a sponsor willing to sponsor your show, right? This means that they are expecting to make a return on investment on that, which makes sense, right? So if they spend $1,000 on your show, they expect to make at least $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000, whatever it is, right? But that means that this is part of their margin. This is part of their communication budget or their advertising budget or their marketing budget, whatever it is. If it's your own offer, this is directly taken into account, meaning if you manage to include this on the show, it's pure profit because it's like your platform, you have the demand and you just match it with the supply. And this is where the magic happens because depending on your offer, especially if it's a high ticket offer, a 4 weeks dog training, for instance, that can be a few hundred, if not a few $1,000s, this can become very, very profitable. Now, not only that, the audience has built a specific link and rapport with you. So when you come to them and say, hey, I can help you further, it's not like, hey, this outside company can help you. It's like, I can help you. Come and see if we can work together. So this is even more powerful because in terms of audience goodwill is better, in terms of niche is better. It's your voice, it's your product, it's you who has been building trust and authority with those people. And all of a sudden you match all this and get them to purchase your product. This is why it's our favorite way to monetize a podcast. So whether you have an offer yet or not, we recommend you to look into this because that can be the most profitable way to do it. We have podcasts in our portfolio who are getting less than 1,000 unique listeners per month and who are making very, very good money out of their podcast. Just because they have this high ticket offer, they have this whole system set up around their podcast and they have a way to match the two. And that allows them to charge their audience for quite a lot of money, but because there is a lot of value there, right? Again, it's not just, hey, I want to sell as much as possible, as high as possible. It's like, how do I make sure that my audience needs match my solution? Now, the fifth way to monetize your podcast. It's a bit a mix of it all, except I would say for ads, but it's something that we've seen clients do very profitably, and we felt that we needed to talk about it. I'm saying we at GHA Marketing and I as Guillaume Jouvencel. And this one is the event planning. Now, what is that? If you have a podcast, if you have built an audience for a few months, if not a few years, you potentially have a very engaged audience, right? What some podcasters like to do is to actually organize events around their podcast, potentially a live podcast recording or even a specific small conference around your podcast or around the topic of your podcast. Now, this takes a lot of efforts and heavy lift, right? It's not for everybody. You need to be knowing what you do. You need to be in a relatively big city, especially if you have a smaller podcast, right? It's all down to how successful is my event going to be if I have a very small audience. So you need to be in a big city. But this can be very interesting because the way this typically works is we have podcasters who go to sponsors and say, hey, I have an audience of 8,000 people. I'm going to organize an event. I can expect 5% of them to show up, so 400 people maybe. But this will be in person. This will be like live, their eyes on me for 2 hours, like no choice. This will be the event of the year in our industry. Overselling it a bit maybe. Do you want to sponsor it, right? So it's a mix of having your own offer, organizing an event, bringing sponsors in to fund the whole thing. You can also get the audience to pay for attending the event, so like a ticket. We do not typically recommend that because you want the payer to be somebody else than your audience in those cases, so a sponsor or eventually a couple of sponsors. This one is very tricky because in terms of audience goodwill, so if somebody shows up at your event, but then they are bombarded with sponsors and advertisement, this is not exactly what they came for. At the same time, this usually costs a lot of money, right? And that's a bit the drawback, and it's upfront money, like you need to book a room, you need to book probably catering, you need to probably book some lighting, a staff, you need to record properly and so on. So this can be very expensive, but if you bring on the right sponsors, then this becomes very, very profitable. We do not recommend everybody to get into this. We have clients who are doing it, who are podcasting for at least 5 years, because that's what it takes to have built such an audience, that you also have the network to be like, okay, I'm going to organize this, and this, and this sponsor are going to help me with the production. So it's a whole different ballgame, but we wanted to talk about it because we've seen clients do this. It can be very, very profitable if done well, but maybe not for the first few years of your podcast. This is it. I hope you enjoyed this video. This video has been produced by Guillaume Jouvencel and his team GHA Marketing. If you have a podcast, or if you're looking to start a podcast and you want to make money out of it, you can reach out or check out our resources on our website, check out what our clients have to say. We'll have a link towards our free ebook in the description. Just go and check it out. 3 ways to generate leads with your show. This can help you if you already have a podcast or if you're looking to start one. Cheers.